The mornings by Lake Lanier always started the same way for George Carter. He'd wake before the sun hit the water, let Baxter out onto the dock, and wait for that first faint shimmer across the lake that told him the world hadn't gone completely insane yet. The air smelled like pine needles and coffee grounds. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of his sprinklers and the lazy slap of water against the pilings. For a man who'd spent 30 years fixing planes in the Air Force, the quiet was its own kind of therapy. No alarms, no sergeants, no deadlines, just the soft whine of cicadas and a cup of black coffee steaming in his hand. He loved that lake house more than any other place he'd lived. It wasn't fancy. Just 2 bedrooms, a screened porch, and a roof that sighed when it rained. But every nail in it had been hammered by him. The siding was new, the gutters finally stopped leaking, and the trim he'd painted himself the week before gleamed like a promise. He'd picked the color carefully. Ocean mist blue. Not flashy, not rebellious. A calm color, the kind that made the white railings pop and the water feel closer. It looked like summer peace. That's what made the letter so jarring. He found it one Saturday morning, tucked beneath the welcome mat like a cowardly invitation. White envelope, neat block font, and the HOA logo stamped on top. Notice of non-compliance. He chuckled at first, thinking it had to be some mix-up. Maybe they meant the Johnsons down the street, the ones with the neon pink flamingo army on their lawn. But then he opened it. Dear Mr. Carter, the color ocean mist blue does not meet the standards of neutral exterior shades outlined in Section 4B of the Lakeside Residential Association Guidelines. You are required to restore the approved color within 14 days to avoid further action. Sincerely, HOA Compliance Committee. He read it twice, then looked at the house. The trim looked beautiful, muted, tasteful. He'd spent an hour at the hardware store holding paint chips to the sunlight, trying to find something exactly like the color on the original brochure from the developer. Neutral, they said. Natural tones encouraged. So he'd gone with something that looked like morning sky meeting water. If that wasn't neutral, he didn't know what was. He folded the letter back up, shook his head, and laughed. Guess the lake reflected too much personality for them, he muttered. Baxter wagged his tail unbothered. The thing about living under an HOA George had learned was that you traded freedom for the illusion of order. In theory, everyone followed the same rules, and the neighborhood stayed beautiful. In practice, it meant some people got high off the smell of power and printer ink. Most days, he didn't mind it. He paid his dues, kept his lawn tidy, waved at the same people every morning. But lately, the HOA had been enthusiastic. They'd added new clarifications to the rulebook almost monthly. Mailbox heights, driveway materials, acceptable bird feeder placement. Still, he figured a little paint dispute wasn't worth raising his blood pressure. He'd send them a polite note, explain that ocean mist blue was within the spectrum of the previously approved sky pebble, and that would be that. He even started drafting an email in his head. Dear Committee, while I appreciate your attention to detail, I assure you the hue in question was chosen with the utmost respect for the neighborhood palette. The next few days passed peacefully enough. He replaced a few shingles, patched a step on the dock, and waved at Linda, the HOA president, as she power-walked by in her matching visor and clipboard holster. She waved back with that fixed realtor smile that meant, I notice things. Dale, the treasurer, trailed behind her like a shadow with khaki shorts and a Bluetooth headset. George couldn't tell if he was on a call or just pretending to sound important. On the third morning, while sipping his coffee on the porch, George spotted movement across the cul-de-sac. The HOA office, a converted one-car garage attached to Linda's house, had its blinds half closed. For a second, he thought he saw them flutter. Someone watching? He chuckled. Paranoia wasn't his style, but he did feel that little prickle at the back of his neck. The same one he used to get before a plane inspection when he knew something was off. Later that afternoon, Hank from 2 doors down stopped by. Hank was another retiree, former postal worker, always in cut-off jeans and flip-flops. You hear they're cracking down on paint colors again? He said, biting into a jelly donut. They said too many people have gone rogue. Rogue? George raised an eyebrow. What are we, pirates? Apparently someone painted their shutters maroon. Hank licked sugar off his thumb. Linda nearly fainted. George laughed. She should get out more. He didn't think much more of it until he got the second letter. This one wasn't tucked under the mat. It was taped to his door. The bold red stamp read, "Final Notice." And beneath it a photograph, his house, taken from the side yard, clearly behind the fence line. The caption underneath, "Non-compliant color, visual evidence attached." That's when disbelief turned into something heavier. Someone had gone onto his property. He looked at the angle of the photo. It was shot from his backyard, near the tool shed. No one could get that view from the street. He flipped the page over. The signature at the bottom, Linda Barnes, HOA President. George's voice stayed low even. "They didn't just peek," he said to Baxter. "They stepped right in." That evening he poured himself a second cup of coffee, not whiskey, not yet, and sat on the porch thinking it through. He'd always believed in civility. The Air Force had taught him that, but it also taught him boundaries. You respected another man's space. You asked before you entered. Even the military had more courtesy than some HOAs. The following morning, he set up one of his old security cameras by the dock, facing the house. He told himself it was for wildlife or maybe the occasional trespassing raccoon, but deep down he knew why. Something in him needed to see to verify. The rule enforcers had crossed an invisible line, and now he couldn't unsee it. A few days later, he came home from the hardware store to find his mailbox wearing a new accessory, a laminated tag that read "Property under review." He laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Under review by who, the Navy?" he muttered. The neighbors across the street pretended not to notice, though their curtains fluttered suspiciously. That night, he checked the footage out of curiosity. Most of it was nothing but crickets, reflections, and the occasional passing car. Then, around 9:40 p.m., two shapes appeared on screen. Flashlights bobbing, silhouettes crossing his side yard. He leaned closer. The resolution was grainy, but there was no mistaking them. Linda's distinctive visor caught the light. Dale followed with a clipboard. They walked along his fence line, pointed at the trim, took pictures, and left. George froze the frame, then leaned back in his chair. A slow grin spread across his face, not out of amusement but out of recognition. He'd seen this sort of thing before. People so sure of their authority they forgot where it stopped. He clicked the mouse, saved the clip, and named it Evidence A. He could already hear his father's voice in his head, the one that used to tell him, "Never argue with a fool in public, son. Just let them hang themselves with their own rope." The next morning, as the sun rose over the lake and the mist rolled across the water, George stepped out with his mug, same as always. But this time, when he looked across at the HOA office, he didn't just see blinds. He saw a chessboard. He took a long sip, smiled faintly, and said to no one in particular, "Well, that letter really did change everything." By the time George finished his second pot of coffee that week, the HOA had escalated from mildly annoying to flat-out ridiculous. The first letter had been bad enough, but this second one, the one taped to his door with a picture from his backyard, had a special kind of arrogance baked into it. He left it on the kitchen counter for a day just to see if it would stop bothering him. Didn't. Every time he passed it, that red "Final Notice" stamp caught the corner of his eye like a mosquito he couldn't swat. He finally called the number printed at the bottom. The line went straight to voicemail. "Thank you for contacting the Lakeside Residential Association. Please leave your inquiry after the tone." He didn't bother leaving a message. He knew what that meant, bureaucratic dodgeball. He'd played that game in the service when people pretended to be unavailable until your patience ran out. A day later, another envelope appeared in his mailbox. Same thin paper, same smug font. This time, they'd attached an invoice for $200, labeled "Administrative Fine." George read it aloud, incredulous. $200. For blue. Baxter tilted his head sympathetically. "That's $20 a shade." Across the street, Linda Barnes' front porch gleamed with two brand-new flower pots shaped like flamingos. One was bright coral, the other screaming magenta. Dale's driveway had a rusting jet ski trailer parked on it, covered with a tarp that flapped like an eyesore flag. George stared at them both for a long moment, then looked back at his house. "Non-compliant," he murmured, letting the irony soak in. On Tuesday morning, his neighbor Hank dropped by with his usual cup of gas station coffee. Hank was grinning. "You got another letter?" he asked. "You keeping score? Buddy, you're the main show on the neighborhood grapevine. They say your house is causing visual disharmony." George laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. "Visual disharmony? What is this, a rock concert?" Hank shrugged. "Linda's been making her rounds. She's got that look, clipboard in one hand, camera in the other. I swear she's got a quota." George's wife, Janet, called that evening from her sister's place in Savannah. She'd been visiting for a few weeks. When he told her about the trespass, she sighed. "Honey, don't poke the bear. Just paint it back to whatever beige they want." He could almost hear her smiling through the phone. "You know you can't win with people like that." He smiled too, though she couldn't see it. "I'm not trying to win," he said. "I just don't like losing to nonsense." The next day, he came home from running errands to find his mailbox bare, except for a laminated yellow tag hanging off it like a scarlet letter. "Property non-compliant." It read in bold type. Below it, "Pending correction." It was signed by Dale, the treasurer, in loopy blue ink. George sighed, ripped it off, and tossed it into the recycling bin. 10 minutes later, while taking Baxter for a walk, he saw two neighbors whispering near their mailboxes. One of them, Nancy, the self-appointed social butterfly, looked away too quickly. The other muttered something George didn't catch but laughed nervously. He gave them both a polite nod. "Afternoon." They nodded back the way people do when they've already read the headline about you. That night, the camera caught something new. Not Linda and Dale this time, he'd half expected that. But a man he didn't recognize walking up his driveway, snapping photos of the siding, then hurrying off. Probably another HOA volunteer inspector. He checked the timestamp. 10:17 p.m. He leaned back in his chair. They're multiplying. By Friday, the gossip had gone from quiet to absurd. A neighbor down the block told Hank that Linda had been claiming George verbally threatened the board. Apparently his polite email asking for clarification qualified as intimidation. The story had grown its own legs by the time it reached the far end of the lake. Someone even said he'd been fined for painting during restricted hours. The thing about small communities, George realized, was that rumor spread faster than truth, especially when truth was boring and rumor came with drama. On Saturday morning, he drove past the HOA office and saw Linda and Dale standing outside with their clipboards, whispering. He gave them a little wave. They didn't wave back. Petty move, sure, but satisfying. That afternoon, he decided to check the HOA bylaws for himself. He dusted off the thick binder they'd handed out when he bought the property 5 years ago. It looked official enough. Dense paragraphs, numbered subsections, and that faint bureaucratic perfume of self-importance. He flipped to section 4B, Exterior Aesthetic Standards. There it was in black and white. Homes shall maintain neutral color schemes consistent with the natural landscape. Acceptable tones include off-white, tan, light gray, and soft blue hues. He read that sentence twice. Soft blue hues. He underlined it with a pen. Then he went outside, took a picture of his trim in the late afternoon light, and compared it to the sample paint chips still in his wallet. It was the same, dead on. Ocean mist blue. Soft, subtle. Exactly what the rules said. He emailed the board that evening, attaching both the photo and the excerpt. His message was short and polite. Dear committee, please find attached evidence confirming that my home's trim color, ocean mist blue, complies with section 4B. Kindly remove the non-compliance status. Best regards, George Carter. He didn't expect an apology. He just wanted them to acknowledge the obvious. But of course they didn't reply. Not the next day. Not the day after. Instead, on Monday morning, another letter arrived, this one thicker. Inside was a notice of escalation, warning him that further noncompliance could lead to suspension of amenity access and potential lien action. That last phrase hit like a slap. A lien. Over paint. George exhaled slowly. Bureaucrats always reached for the biggest hammer they could find, even if the nail was made of air. By noon, Hank came over again, half grinning, half serious. "You see the Facebook page?" he asked. "I try not to." "Well, you're trending." Hank held up his phone. Someone had posted a photo of George's house with the caption, "Our neighborhood's rebel painter. Thoughts?" The comments were a battlefield. Half the neighbors defended him. "Looks fine to me," while the other half were sharpening their digital pitchforks. Rules are rules. We all agreed to them. If he gets away with it, what's next? George chuckled softly. Democracy in action. More like dramacracy, Hank said. That evening, George sat on his dock watching the sunset. The blue trim glowed against the orange sky. Perfectly peaceful. Perfectly harmless. He thought about the absurdity of it all, how adults could turn the shade of paint into a moral issue. Maybe it wasn't really about color. Maybe it was about control. The kind of people who couldn't stand when something didn't fit their narrow picture of order. Then came the final insult. He woke one morning to find a small orange sticker on his front door. Pending enforcement review, external assessment conducted. The phrasing was so bureaucratic it almost made him laugh. But when he peeled it off, he noticed something strange. Boot prints in the damp soil by the side of the house. Fresh. The fence gate slightly ajar. He checked the camera footage again. The date stamp read 9:42 p.m. 2 figures. Flashlights. Clipboards. It was Linda and Dale. They had actually come onto his property again. This time after dark. Moving along the side yard like burglars auditioning for a civic theater play. He paused the video on a still frame. Linda's visor caught the light. Dale scribbled something on his clipboard. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it weren't so arrogant. He hit save, labeled it Evidence B, and leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. The next morning, while mowing the lawn, he noticed Linda's car slow down at the end of the street. She looked straight ahead, not waving. Dale sat in the passenger seat, pretending to be on the phone. George gave them a friendly salute anyway. They didn't respond. The whole thing was starting to feel like a low-budget spy movie, except the villains wore khakis and sunscreen. When he walked back inside, the sunlight caught the letter on his counter again. That same red, final notice. He looked at it for a long time before folding it neatly and placing it into a manila envelope labeled, "For later." Then he poured himself another cup of coffee and smiled to no one in particular. "I thought that was the end of it," he said quietly. "I was wrong." George had always believed in two kinds of battles. The loud ones that made headlines, and the quiet ones that actually changed things. The loud ones were for people who wanted attention. The quiet ones were for people who wanted results. And right now, standing in his kitchen, staring at still frames of Linda and Dale sneaking through his backyard with flashlights, he decided this battle would be quiet, but not soft. He'd served too long in a system built on rules to let someone twist them into weapons. If there was one thing he knew how to do, it was to play by the book, right down to the comma, and still win. He printed 3 screenshots from the footage, each one clearer than the last. Linda's visor. Dale's clipboard. Their footprints matched the ones he'd seen by the fence. The timestamp was neat and undeniable. 9:42 p.m. He slipped the photos into a folder, labeled it HOA Trespass, and set it on his kitchen table. Then he made a pot of coffee. The next day was the monthly HOA meeting. Normally, he skipped them. Too much talking, not enough listening. But this time he shaved, ironed a shirt, and showed up 5 minutes early. The clubhouse smelled like instant coffee and powdered donuts. A folding table sat up front with 3 chairs. Linda in the middle, Dale beside her, and a woman he didn't recognize flipping through papers. When Linda spotted him, her smile froze halfway. "Oh, George. I didn't expect. I'm a member, aren't I?" he said pleasantly. "Thought I'd attend." The meeting started with the usual parade of complaints. Trash bins left out too long. Kids' bikes left on driveways. Someone's fence being a shade too dark. George sat quietly, hands folded, waiting his turn. When Linda finally got to new business, he raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Carter?" "I'd like to address a concern about procedure," he said evenly. "Specifically, about property inspections conducted without homeowner consent." Dale shifted in his seat. Linda adjusted her glasses. "All inspections are conducted in accordance with community guidelines," she said in her practiced realtor tone. "Our team has the right to ensure compliance." George interrupted gently. "Even at 9:42 at night?" The room went silent. "I'm sorry." Linda blinked. He opened the folder and slid the photos across the table. "That's you and Dale on my property, June 14th. Fence gate open, flashlights on. I was out of town that night. Would you like me to play the video? Or will the stills do?" A few neighbors leaned forward. Dale cleared his throat, stammering something about necessary assessment. George smiled faintly. "You might want to reread your own bylaws, Linda. Section 6C. No member or representative may enter private property without written consent or emergency justification." He tapped the photos. "Neither applies here." The woman beside Linda, apparently the HOA secretary, looked mortified. "He's right," she whispered. Linda's face flushed pink. "We were verifying a color discrepancy. There was no harm done." George nodded slowly. "No harm, maybe, but a violation, definitely." He stood, collected his folder, and added, "You're lucky I'm just asking for an apology and not a police report." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few smothered chuckles. Dale sank lower in his chair. George turned to go, pausing at the doorway. "Oh, and by the way, your shed out back? It's painted desert sand. The guidelines say neutral tones. You might want to check if that qualifies." He didn't slam the door when he left, but he didn't need to. The silence behind him was loud enough. That night, as he sat on the dock with Baxter, he thought about what to do next. He didn't want revenge. Not really. He just wanted balance, to remind people that rules cut both ways. But he also knew bullies rarely learned lessons without a mirror held up to their behavior. So he started building one. The next morning, he drove into town and bought a small portable projector. Then he stopped by the grocery store for 24 donuts, assorted, the good kind, and a box of coffee to go. On the way home, he sent out a group email to a dozen neighbors. The subject line was simple: "Coffee and clarity? Saturday, 9 a.m., my dock." When Saturday came, the sun was out, the air clear and curiosity high. About 20 people showed up, folding chairs in hand. Some he knew well. Others he'd only nodded to over mailboxes. George stood by the projector with his coffee, smiling like a man about to tell a good story. "Morning, folks," he began. "Appreciate you coming out. I just wanted to share something that happened recently. Something I think we should all know about." He pressed play. The video rolled, showing the two familiar silhouettes sneaking around his property. When Linda's visor glinted in the flashlight beam, a few gasps escaped the crowd. Someone muttered, "Is that really her?" "Sure is," George said mildly. "I didn't invite them, and they didn't have permission." The clip ended. Silence hung for a beat, then laughter bubbled up, half shock, half delight. A man in the back said, "They actually broke in? For paint?" George grinned. Ocean mist blue, apparently, is a threat to democracy. Everyone laughed harder. The absurdity of it was too good not to enjoy. One neighbor, a retired lawyer named Ed, raised an eyebrow. "That's a violation of private property. You could press charges." George shrugged. "I could, but I won't. I just thought we could use a reminder that fairness works both ways." Hank chimed in, holding a donut. "You should send that to the HOA Facebook page." "I don't have Facebook," George said, "but I'm sure somebody here does." That was all it took. By evening, the clip was online with the caption, "When your HOA takes inspection a little too seriously." Within hours, comments poured in laughter, outrage, and a surprising amount of solidarity. Even residents from nearby communities chimed in, "Same thing happened to us," and "HOAs are out of control." George didn't reply to any of it. He didn't have to. The truth was doing just fine on its own. The following day, Linda sent an email to all residents titled, "Important clarification, regarding recent misunderstandings. It was a masterpiece of non-apology, dense, defensive, and written like a legal brief. Words like context, miscommunication, and standard procedure peppered every paragraph. George printed it out, highlighted a few key phrases, and stuck it on his fridge under a magnet shaped like a fish. Baxter barked at it once, as if in agreement. Over the next week, things got quieter, but not calmer. The air in the neighborhood had changed. People waved more, but it was the kind of wave that said, "I know, and I'm pretending not to." The HOA office blinds stayed drawn. And yet, George couldn't shake the feeling that Linda wasn't done. He spent his evenings reviewing the bylaws again, marking every clause that could come in handy. Trespassing laws, data privacy, even the HOA's own conflict resolution policies. He wasn't hunting for loopholes, he was building armor. Then, midweek, an idea struck him. If they want transparency, I'll give it to them. He spent a day putting together a simple PowerPoint titled, Understanding HOA Boundaries. It wasn't angry or accusatory, just factual with screenshots, bylaws, and a dash of humor. He even added a title slide with a joke. When good HOAs go bad. That Saturday, he printed flyers, community coffee and discussion, open to all homeowners. He left one on every porch, even Linda's. When the day arrived, more people came than he expected. 30 at least, filling his backyard and dock. Someone brought muffins. Someone else brought folding tables. The lake shimmered behind him like a stage backdrop. He began simply, "I love this neighborhood. That's why I live here. That's why I fix my roof, paint my trim, pay my dues. I don't want to fight anyone. But I do want to live like we're all on the same side of the fence." He clicked to the next slide. Photos of the trespass, the bylaw section, and the words "respect goes both ways." The crowd nodded. By the end of the meeting, the laughter had turned into applause. Someone shouted, "You should run for the board." George just smiled, shaking his head. "Nah, I'm better at retirement than politics." But that night, sitting on the dock under a sky streaked with stars, he knew something had shifted. The fear that the HOA always relied on, the quiet compliance of people who didn't want trouble, was cracking. His neighbors weren't scared anymore. They were curious, awake, maybe even a little bold. He leaned back, Baxter resting his chin on his boot, and watched the reflection of his house ripple across the water. The blue trim glowed faintly in the moonlight. "They had no idea what was coming," he said softly and smiled. The following week began with an odd calm, the kind that doesn't last. The video from George's little coffee meeting had spread far beyond his lake community. A cousin of Hank's had shared it on Facebook, and before long, a local talk radio host mentioned the Lake Lanier HOA who thought they were the FBI. George hadn't even intended to embarrass anyone. All he wanted was a little sunlight on the nonsense. But once sunlight hits mold, it spreads. By Tuesday, the HOA's email inbox was overflowing. Residents demanded an emergency meeting. Others were asking if they could see the association's expense reports or bylaws themselves. Linda responded with a long, formal notice taped to every mailbox. Special session called Addressing Recent Misinformation. When George found his copy, fluttering on his porch, he just smiled and muttered, "Oh, this ought to be good." The meeting took place 2 days later in the community clubhouse. Folding chairs, stale air, the smell of cheap coffee and nervous sweat. Every HOA drama eventually finds its way into that fluorescently lit room. George arrived a few minutes early, nodding to neighbors who pretended not to be on his side even though they absolutely were. He spotted Linda at the front, rearranging her papers with the intensity of someone about to testify before Congress. Dale hovered nearby, still clutching his clipboard like a shield. Linda called the meeting to order, her voice a little too bright. "We're here today to clarify certain events that have been misrepresented online." A hand shot up immediately. "You mean the part where you broke into George's yard?" someone asked. A ripple of laughter rolled through the crowd. Linda's smile tightened. "We did not break in. We conducted an exterior review as permitted under HOA oversight." George leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He didn't need to speak. The crowd did it for him. After dark, another voice piped up. With flashlights. Without permission? Every question landed like a pebble in still water, widening the cracks in Linda's composure. Dale finally blurted out. We were trying to maintain the standards everyone agreed to when they moved here. Yeah, Hank called from the back. What standards, that burglar chic? Laughter again, louder this time. Linda slammed her folder shut. This hostility is unnecessary. The association was acting within its rights. George stood slowly, calm as a sermon. If that's true, then why did the police officer I spoke to yesterday disagree? A silence so thick you could hear the old ceiling fan whir. George let it linger just long enough before continuing. He said, and I quote, "They'd better hope you don't press charges." Linda's face drained of color. Dale tried to jump in, but his voice cracked halfway through the word, miscommunication. George didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. I'm not here to humiliate anyone, but what happened wasn't right. And if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone in this room. You could feel the shift, the crowd leaning toward him now, not her. He placed a small stack of papers on the front table. These are copies of the state trespassing statute, your own HOA bylaws, and, for good measure, a letter I've already mailed to the Georgia Department of Consumer Affairs. He didn't add that the letter was mostly symbolic. The sound of the words alone was enough to make Linda swallow hard. For a brief moment, nobody breathed. Then someone clapped. Just one person at first, then several more until the sound filled the room like rain on a tin roof. Linda tried to gavel the room back to order. This is completely inappropriate, she barked, but the crowd had found its courage now. Appropriate was last week, George said softly. You missed it. He left before they could recover, walking out into the warm evening air, the sound of argument echoing behind him. He smiled, not smugly but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd spent years fixing broken engines and now had finally fixed something human. The next morning, the HOA Facebook page was chaos. Posts, memes, comments. Someone had edited a photo of Linda, holding a flashlight with the caption Neighborhood Watch. Season 2. Another showed Dale with a cartoon magnifying glass and the words, Compliance Detective. George couldn't help but laugh when Hank showed him on his phone. You've gone viral, Hank said, grinning. You're the HOA Avenger. I didn't do anything heroic, George said. I just left the porch light on. By afternoon, Linda had deleted half the posts and replaced them with an official statement. We are aware of recent social media activity. The Lakeside Association values transparency and integrity. The problem with claiming transparency, George thought, is that everyone suddenly starts looking. That's when things got truly interesting. A few residents requested to review HOA financials. Someone else asked to see the minutes from last year's budget meetings. A rumor started that Dale had been reimbursing himself for administrative supplies. Whether true or not didn't matter, the trust was gone. 2 days later, an anonymous tip appeared on the local community forum claiming certain board members used HOA funds for personal landscaping services. The thread exploded. Linda called another emergency meeting, this one labeled Confidential Members Only. The irony was rich. By then, George barely had to lift a finger. The neighborhood was policing itself. Still, he knew he needed to stay careful. Winning against small-time power can turn ugly if you gloat. So he stayed polite, mowing his lawn, waving to everyone, smiling at Linda when she passed by, pretending not to see him. That evening, he came home to find another envelope in his mailbox. He almost laughed. They never learn, he told Baxter. But this one was different. Heavy paper, certified mail sticker. Inside was a letter from the HOA attorney. Cease and desist notice, defamation of association. He read it 3 times, then whistled low. They're really doubling down. It accused him of publicly disparaging the reputation of the board and disseminating confidential information. George snorted. Confidential? Paint, not nuclear codes. He sat down at his desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began drafting a response. But halfway through, he stopped, smiled, and set the pen down. Words wouldn't be enough this time. Instead, he printed every screenshot, every letter, every still frame. He organized them into a tidy binder labeled Documentation for Reference. Then he made 3 copies, one for himself, one for his neighbor Ed the lawyer, and one for the HOA's attorney. He dropped the last one in the office mailbox with a sticky note. For your records, since accuracy seems to be in short supply. That evening, as the sun slid low over the lake, George walked down to the dock with a beer in hand. He breathed in the scent of water and pine, feeling the cool boards under his feet. He'd expected anger or exhaustion, but what he felt instead was something calmer. Control. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't plotting revenge. He was simply waiting for the inevitable collapse of overconfidence. Bureaucrats, in his experience, always self-destruct. All you have to do is give them room. Sure enough, the next morning, his phone buzzed with messages from neighbors. Screenshots, gossip, snippets of outrage. The HOA had apparently overplayed its hand. Someone on the board leaked the attorney letter, and now residents were furious that dues money was being used to intimidate one of their own. Linda tried to contain it with another post. We are working to restore order. But the only comment underneath was from Hank. Order's fine, Linda. It's the trespassing that needs work. By midweek, someone taped a new sign to the HOA office door. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Next to it, someone else had drawn a smiley face with the words, including board members. George laughed so hard he had to sit down on the porch steps. That night, he got one more letter in the mail, this time not from Linda, but from the state agency he'd contacted earlier. It began formally, as government letters do. Dear Mr. Carter, thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. An inquiry into HOA procedural conduct will commence shortly. He didn't even make it to the end before chuckling. Well, he said to Baxter, guess we're official now. Then, with perfect timing, his phone buzzed again, Hank calling. You won't believe this, Hank said between laughs. Linda's calling another meeting. She says it's a leadership transition discussion. George leaned back in his chair, eyes on the water. Translation. They're jumping ship. He took another sip of beer and looked up at the night sky, the faint glow of porch lights dancing across the lake. At this point, he said softly, I've got to ask, have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Drop your story in the comments, hit subscribe if you love poetic justice, and let's see how many of us have survived HOA brutality. He smiled at his own little joke, then nodded to Baxter. Anyway, back to the meeting, where things got very, very interesting, because the next letter he received didn't come from Linda or Dale. It came stamped with the state seal of Georgia, and it was addressed not just to him but to the entire board. He turned it over slowly, the paper thick and official. Then he grinned. Looks like the cavalry finally read the bylaws, he said. And I didn't even have to shout. That letter changed everything again. The certified letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, thick enough to make the mailbox door stick. George stood on his porch, coffee mug in one hand, envelope in the other, staring at the return address printed in neat government type, Georgia Department of Consumer Affairs, Community Housing Division. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. He hadn't expected them to actually follow up, but apparently someone in Atlanta still believed in rules. He brought it inside, sliced it open with his pocket knife, and read the first line slowly. This letter concerns a preliminary inquiry into allegations of procedural misconduct by the Lakeside Residential Association Board. He smiled, that quiet kind of smile people wear when something right finally happens. Baxter wagged his tail as if he understood. We're not there yet, buddy, George said, patting the dog's head. But it's a good start. The letter went on for 3 pages, government tone, polite but unmistakably serious. They were sending an investigator to review compliance procedures and interview affected homeowners. Translation. The HOA was about to sweat. By noon, word had spread. Hank called first. You see the Facebook page? Linda's losing it. George chuckled. I don't do Facebook. Well, it's a show. She posted that false accusations are hurting the community and that a certain resident is spreading misinformation. People are tearing her apart in the comments. You're a folk hero, man. I didn't do anything heroic, George said. I just read the fine print. But even he had to admit, it felt satisfying watching the same people who'd once whispered behind curtains now standing up publicly, defending him. The tide had turned. 2 days later, a silver sedan pulled up to the HOA office. Out stepped a woman in a gray blazer, badge clipped to her lapel, clipboard under her arm. She was the investigator. By sunset, half the neighborhood had invented 10 different versions of what she said. But one fact was certain. She spent over 2 hours inside, and when she left, Linda's face was the color of old chalk. By evening, George's inbox pinged with an email from the HOA. The subject line was short: clarification and apology. He opened it, expecting some lawyerly jargon, but it was surprisingly straightforward. Dear Mr. Carter, the Lakeside Residential Association sincerely apologizes for the unauthorized entry onto your property. The board acknowledges that this incident did not follow appropriate procedure and deeply regrets any inconvenience or distress caused. Your fine has been rescinded and a refund will be issued within 7 business days. We also appreciate your commitment to maintaining the community's appearance and spirit. Sincerely, Linda Barnes, HOA President. George let out a slow whistle. 7 business days, he said aloud. That's government speak for "we surrender." He printed the email and pinned it on the fridge right next to the old final notice. The contrast was poetic. 2 letters from the same sender, one accusing him, the other apologizing. Bureaucratic yin and yang. By the weekend, word got around that Dale had resigned, for personal reasons. No one was surprised. His name had already become a running joke. At the community park, someone taped a paper badge to a trash can that said, HOA Vice Chair Dale. The humor wasn't mean-spirited, just cathartic. The neighborhood had finally remembered how to laugh. Linda, however, didn't quit. She wasn't built for surrender, only spin. She tried to salvage control by holding another public meeting. George decided to attend, partly for closure, partly for amusement. The clubhouse was fuller than he'd ever seen it. Folding chairs lined every wall. The air buzzed with anticipation. Linda opened with her usual polished smile, though her voice trembled around the edges. I'd like to begin by addressing recent events, she said, clutching her prepared notes. Mistakes were made, and we've taken corrective action. Moving forward, we want to rebuild trust. Someone called out, start by staying off people's lawns. Laughter erupted. Linda's cheeks tightened, but she pressed on. To demonstrate good faith, the board will be reviewing all community regulations for fairness and clarity. George raised his hand. Does that include Section 4B? A murmur rippled through the room. Everyone knew what that meant. Linda hesitated. Yes, she said finally. Including Section 4B. Good, George said calmly. Might be nice if soft blue hues didn't require night vision goggles. Even Linda laughed at that one, though it sounded more like a sigh. The rest of the meeting passed with minimal fireworks. By the end, people were clapping. Not for her, but for the sense that something had changed. The fear was gone. The HOA had gone from untouchable to accountable, and it had happened without shouting, without lawsuits, without anyone throwing a punch. Just patience, evidence, and a camera. The following week, George got his refund check. $200 and a short note saying the case was closed. He didn't cash it immediately. Instead, he slipped it into a frame alongside the apology letter and hung it in the hallway above his toolbox. The irony made him grin every time he walked past. The HOA had funded his decor. Still, he wasn't bitter. If anything, he felt lighter. The whole ordeal had reminded him of something he'd nearly forgotten. That quiet persistence beats loud authority every time. One afternoon, as he repainted the dock railing, Hank strolled over carrying 2 beers. So what's next for the neighborhood's freedom fighter? George smirked. Retirement, same as yesterday. Maybe I'll paint the shed purple, just to keep them alert. You're kidding, right? Mostly. They sat on the dock, feet dangling above the water, watching the sunlight shimmer off the lake. It was peaceful again. the way it had been before all the nonsense started. But the peace felt earned now, not assumed. Across the street, the HOA's storage shed was getting a makeover, 3 volunteers repainting it beige after the investigator found that its color, ironically, didn't meet the community's own neutrality rule. When Hank pointed it out, George nearly spit out his beer laughing. "Poetic justice," he said. "Can't make this stuff up." Linda kept her head down for the next few weeks. Rumor had it she planned to finish her term quietly and not seek re-election. Dale moved to another town entirely, though someone later said they spotted him working at a marina, still holding a clipboard. By midsummer, things were back to normal. The sprinklers hissed in the mornings, kids rode bikes, and the sound of lawnmowers filled the weekends. George finally stopped checking the mailbox with suspicion. The only letters now were utility bills and the occasional flyer for local landscaping services. One evening, he stood on his dock again. The sky streaked orange and pink. Baxter curled at his feet. The house behind him glowed softly, the blue trim catching the fading light. He ran his fingers along the railing, proud and content. Funny thing, he thought, how the smallest battles teach the biggest lessons. You can fight a war without ever raising your voice, if you know which tools to use. He lifted his mug, a toast to the quiet. Here's to paperwork, patience, and poetic justice. Baxter barked once, as if in agreement. A few days later, another letter arrived, this one thin, plain, no logos. It was from a neighbor he barely knew, an older woman who'd lived 2 streets over. "George, I just wanted to thank you. My husband and I had trouble with the HOA last year over our deck color, but we were too afraid to fight it. Watching what you did gave us courage. We're repainting it this weekend, the same color it was before. Maybe I'll even bring donuts to the next meeting. Sincerely, Patricia M." He folded the note gently, smiling. Maybe that was the real victory. Not the refund, not the apology, but the reminder that a little backbone spreads. That Saturday morning, George finally mowed his lawn again. The sound of the mower buzzed through the air, steady and content. When he finished, he leaned on the handle, surveying the freshly cut grass, the gleam of his house, the rippling water beyond. For the first time in months, he felt no tension in his shoulders, no irritation when he saw Linda's car drive by. She slowed briefly, hesitated, then raised a tentative hand in greeting. He returned it with a nod. No hard feelings, no smugness, just an understanding. He walked back up to the porch, sat down with his coffee, and let the breeze roll over him. The lake was calm, the world simple again. As he watched the reflection of the blue trim ripple on the water, he laughed quietly to himself. "They made all that noise about neutrality," he said. "And now the only color left standing is mine." Inside the house, the framed letter and refund check gleamed under the light. Proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or flashy. It's tidy, polite, and perfectly documented. Justice didn't need to roar. It just needed a paper trail. He raised his mug again, eyes on the horizon. "I finally mowed the lawn," he said softly, smiling this time. The summer after the whole ordeal unfolded felt different. Quieter, slower, more human. The kind of quiet that wasn't fragile anymore, but earned. The HOA meetings still happened, sure, but now they felt like what they were supposed to be. A handful of neighbors sitting around with coffee, not generals in a suburban war room. The rules still existed. No one was repainting their house neon pink. But the tone had changed. You could feel it in the air, the same way you can feel a thunderstorm lift once it's done proving its point. George noticed it most in the little things. People waved again, genuinely this time, not out of obligation. The neighbors who used to peek through curtains now stopped by to chat about fishing or lawn fertilizer. Even Linda seemed human. She'd started attending meetings without the clipboard armor, her hair down, her voice softer. No more grand speeches about curb appeal. No more midnight inspections. It was one of those warm Georgia evenings when the world feels half-dreamed. The lake perfectly still except for a few ripples from a passing duck. George sat on his porch, Baxter snoring at his feet, listening to the distant hum of crickets and the clink of a neighbor's wind chime. The air smelled like grilled corn and cut grass. Peaceful. He thought back to how absurd it had all been, grown adults sneaking around with flashlights over a paint color. It was funny now, in hindsight, but it hadn't been at the time. The anger, the disbelief, the quiet insult of being treated like a child on his own property. He'd handled it calmly, but he could admit now that there were nights he'd sat awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it was worth it. All that reading of bylaws, drafting letters, playing chess with people who didn't even know the rules. But then he'd look at that framed apology in the hallway and know it was. Some people collect trophies. George collected balance. He didn't become a hero, didn't want to be one. But the neighborhood treated him like some kind of folk legend anyway. A quiet rebellion icon, the guy who beat the HOA with a camera and common sense. It made him chuckle every time he heard it. He hadn't beaten anyone. He just reminded them they weren't kings. Still, there were moments of humor that kept it all alive. A few weeks after the apology, he got a text from Hank with a photo attached. Someone had put up a pink flamingo in their yard with a sign that read, "Compliant and fabulous." Below it, someone else added another flamingo with a speech bubble. "At least I didn't trespass." The whole street laughed for days. George didn't take credit for any of it, but people knew the tone had changed because of him. When Linda resigned officially at the end of her term, the election for the new president was almost friendly. A retired teacher named Carol took over, firm but kind, the kind of person who solved things with coffee, not confrontation. Her first act as president was symbolic but brilliant. She removed all the under-review tags from the community storage shed and replaced them with a single wooden plaque that read, "Welcome home." The neighborhood threw a small barbecue to celebrate. George showed up with his famous slow-cooked ribs and a cooler of lemonade. Linda came too, surprisingly, and brought potato salad. People mingled, laughed, swapped stories. No one mentioned the past directly, but it hung there like an old bruise that everyone had finally stopped poking. At one point, Linda walked up to George by the grill. She hesitated before speaking. "You know," she said, "I didn't mean for it to go that far." He turned the ribs with his tongs, glanced at her, and smiled. "I know," he said. "Sometimes power sneaks up on good intentions." She nodded, exhaling through her nose. "I guess I learned that lesson the hard way." He handed her a plate. Well, at least the hard way still came with good ribs. They both laughed, a sound that felt like an ending and a beginning all at once. After the barbecue, as the sun sank into the lake and kids ran around chasing fireflies, George sat on the dock watching the lights reflect on the water. The reflection of his house, trim still proudly ocean mist blue, shimmered between ripples. The color looked even better now, somehow. Not just paint anymore, but proof. He thought about the strange poetry of it all. That peace could come from patience, that laughter could outlast anger, and that sometimes the only way to win was to stay calm while everyone else lost their heads. It reminded him of his Air Force days, how planes didn't fly because of force, but balance. Lift versus drag. Action and correction. The HOA was no different, really. It just needed a little adjustment to stay airborne. A few days later, George got another letter, though this one made him laugh out loud. It was handwritten, neat cursive on lined paper. "Dear Mr. Carter, I'm writing as a member of the Magnolia Shores HOA down in Gainesville. We saw the article about you in our community newsletter. I just wanted to say thank you. You inspired our neighborhood to finally push back when our board tried to fine a family for putting up Christmas lights too early. We won. Sometimes a little backbone is contagious. Sincerely, Joyce W." George read it twice, still smiling. He didn't know how the story had gotten that far. Probably Hank's cousin again, but it warmed him in a way no apology ever could. Maybe what started as one man's quiet standoff had become something bigger. That evening, as he walked Baxter down the road, a few neighbors waved from their porches. One of them, a young couple new to the neighborhood, stopped him. "Hey, Mr. Carter," the man said. "Is it true you made the HOA change its rules?" George laughed. "I didn't make anyone do anything. I just asked them to read the ones they already had." The woman smiled. "Well, thanks. We were nervous about moving here after hearing all the stories. But everyone says things are different now." "Different's good," George said. means progress. He continued down the street, the gravel crunching softly under his boots. The sound reminded him of the morning after the first letter, how heavy it had felt then. Now the same ground felt lighter. Perspective does that. Back at the house, he brewed his usual cup of late-night coffee and sat out on the porch. The wind was soft, carrying faint music from someone's backyard radio. He thought about how easily small things spiral into big ones when ego gets involved, and how quickly they shrink again when humor returns. Maybe that was the real moral of it all. Control isn't about rules. It's about restraint. Baxter nudged his leg, tail thumping. George reached down and scratched behind his ears. We did all right, didn't we? The dog sighed in agreement. From where he sat, he could see the HOA office, lights off, quiet. The once ominous little building now looked harmless, almost quaint. No one lurking behind blinds. Just stillness. He raised his mug slightly, a private salute. Later that week, the HOA newsletter arrived with a new section titled Community Voices. The first feature story, Neighbor Spotlight, George Carter. It wasn't grand, just a few paragraphs about civic responsibility and respectful dialogue. But at the bottom, there was a line that made him chuckle. Special thanks to Mr. Carter for reminding us that leadership begins with listening. He tore the page out and tucked it behind the framed apology letter on his wall. Seemed fitting. Life settled into its old rhythm again. Mornings of coffee and mist. Evenings of still water and porch lights flickering across the lake. The chaos faded into memory. A funny story to tell at neighborhood cookouts or whenever someone new moved in. And every so often, when a letter from the HOA arrived, routine updates, meeting notices, he'd grin before opening it. The war was over. One Saturday morning, he watched a family unload moving boxes next door. The husband waved awkwardly. Hey, you're George, right? The guy from the HOA story. That's me, George said. The man laughed. Good to know you're on the block. Makes us feel safe. George smiled. Don't worry. I'm retired. I only fight when someone paints over decency. They both laughed and he went back inside. The framed apology caught the morning light again as he passed it, the gold of the sun glinting off the glass. He paused, looked at it, then turned to the window overlooking the lake. The color of the trim, his so-called non-neutral blue, glowed in the sunrise, gentle and proud. Last week, he murmured. They fined someone for having a pink flamingo. He smiled, shaking his head. Maybe that'll be next week's story. He sat back in his chair, the wood creaking comfortably beneath him. So if your HOA ever sends you a letter like mine, he said softly, half to himself, half to the world, remember, you can't control the petty, but you can outsmart it. And with that, George lifted his mug to the calm lake horizon. The water rippled faintly, reflecting blue and gold, steady and sure, just like him.